All the second stage tanks now pressurized. Astronauts report it feels good. T-minus 15 seconds. Guidance is internal. 12, 11, 10, 9. Ignition sequence start. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Guys, why are you so hostile to feminists? Don't you know feminism is about equality? Patriarchy hurts men too. The stages to a winning strategy of nonviolent activism have often been described as follows. First, they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they fight you, then you win. Feminists have taken a different approach, following up indifference and then mockery with attempts to absorb the movement and control its direction via claims that feminism already is men's activism. This often manifests in the repetition of talking points from Lindy West's article titled, "If I Admit That Man-Hating is a Thing, Will You Stop Turning It Into a Self-Fulfilling Prophecy?" The talking points boil down to two main arguments. One is that men's rights activists and feminists want the same things and oppose the same things, so we should be working together. The other is that all of men's issues are caused by the ever-present, looming specter of patriarchy, and since feminism already exists to fight against patriarchy, there is no need for a men's rights movement. Both arguments are total bullshit. The patriarchy of feminist imagining simply does not exist, and the two movements are at odds on fundamental points of advocacy. One oft-cited example of our so-called common ground is opposition to the social imposition of stereotypical gender roles on the individual. This relies on assuming that men's rights activists and feminists have the same objections to the same social phenomena for the same reasons. A look at the two movements' approaches to various gender issues, however, shows that we do not. Men's rights discussion on gender roles, which, by the way, often doesn't use the term gender roles, centers mostly on two things. One is gender differences and accountability, how that relates to individual rights and freedoms, and how it affects society's response to conflict between men and women. The other is the concept of male disposability, in which there is a general society-wide expectation that men's interests will take a back seat to pretty much everything else. Men's rights activists object not just to the imposition of gender roles and stereotypes, but to their use as a tool to subjugate men to women's interests. This can be seen in fathers' rights activism, wherein we object to the treatment of men as walking wallets for the mother, rather than family members with as much right as mothers to place importance on their relationship with their kids, and whose involvement is as beneficial to their kids as mother involvement is. When it comes to men's issues, feminist discussion on gender roles centers mostly on justifying female victim narratives and demonizing boys and men by gendering and generalizing dysfunction to them, and then blaming assertive and rugged masculinity for it. This can be seen in feminism's toxic masculinity narrative, which falsely represents genderless dysfunction like insecurity, violence, and prejudices as gender-specific behavior caused by social pressure to conform to those rugged or assertive stereotypes. Then, feminist initiatives like It's On Us and He for She make it very clear that their objection is not to gender roles being imposed on men, but male adherence to gender roles for reasons other than women's benefit. These same differences can be seen in discussion on intimate partner and sexual violence, wherein men's rights activists oppose feminism's victim narratives and double standards on what constitutes violence and who is accountable for their actions, seek recourse for victims of false accusers, and advocate for equal recourse for male victims of female violence to that which society gives female victims of male violence. Feminists, on the other hand, promote a handicapping female victim narrative that demonizes men and boys as thuggish buffoons who accidentally engage in sexual violence out of lack of understanding of consent and use partner violence as a means of domination and control. Rather than seeking better communication and conflict management as solutions, feminists promote an ever-tightening grip of authoritarian control over human relationships based on definitions of violence that are kept vague enough to facilitate a wide range of accusations, while providing no useful guidance on functional interaction. That is used to justify numerous initiatives purportedly for the prevention of said violence, and demand funding for those initiatives. The closest the two movements appear to get on this note is in discussion of social shaming of men and boys for failure to conform to stereotypical rugged masculinity, but even in this, we differ significantly upon closer examination. Men's rights activists don't have to erase any manifestation of masculinity in order to argue that failure to conform to it is not wrong, nor do we argue for the imposition of any particular stereotype on men for anyone's benefit. Feminists, on the other hand, do both, demonizing ruggedness as an attack on less rugged men when arguing for the feminization of men, yet demanding ruggedness from men when arguing that men must be expected to protect women from other men. Feminists even have their own ultimate dysfunctional stereotype for men, patriarchy theory, which treats them simultaneously as omni-responsible gods and devils at fault for every feminist complaint. Despite such differences in approach to gender issues, we are frequently told by both feminists and middle grounders that feminists are fighting for remedies to men's issues, and the two movements should cooperate. Again, I have to point out, that's bullshit. For decades, the civil rights of men have been attacked, beaten down, and cut away by the mainstream politically active, in-power, established feminist movement. Feminist groups like the National Organization for Women have obtained social, political, and legal power by slandering men as a demographic, and then demanding to be protected from them by men in positions of responsibility. Feminist advocated law and policy in the U.S. has whittled away at the due process rights of accused men, provided incentives to make false accusations, and made restraining order abuse easy to commit and hard to counter. They've advocated for laws which remove the presumption of innocence from men accused of intimate partner and sexual violence. The handicapping of an accused man's defense makes false conviction a significant risk, keeping organizations like the Innocence Project in the U.S. busy undoing the damage done by a severely imbalanced, heavily biased legal system. Feminist groups have advocated for federally required changes in disciplinary policy at colleges and universities, which led to numerous lawsuits by young men who had been railroaded in sexual misconduct cases at their schools, publicly slandered, and wrongfully expelled. This year, feminist politicians, commentators, media, and organizations publicly opposed reforming those policies to preserve due process and ensure fair treatment of all involved parties, preferring instead to preserve a system that has repeatedly been very publicly demonstrated to be dysfunctional and damaging. Feminists have opposed family court reform. They have promoted discrimination against men for women's benefit in the workplace. They've promoted narratives demonizing all men and only men as potentially violent with perverse sexual needs and a bad attitude toward women, and even deemed individual men who strive to disprove those assumptions abusive. They portray men's complaints about their circumstances as signs of laziness and callousness toward women. Now that men's activism has been discovered by the mainstream media, feminists are going through their old playbook again, first demanding that we be ignored, then ridiculing us as a movement of social malcontents who don't want to live by society's rules, hate women and children, and only care about ourselves. And when that hasn't shut us up, now we're seeing claims of olive branches being extended to us. Oh yes, feminists can acknowledge that there are instances of legal disadvantage to men, instances when men can be victimized, and instances when social and legal taboos facilitate that victimization. But that apparent sympathy quickly gives way to existing shame and blame narratives. Don't we know those are just manifestations of toxic masculinity? And how dare we advocate solutions to those issues without feminist supervision? How dare men advocate for themselves? Why, if feminists really care about men's welfare, would they oppose men's advocacy? Maybe it's because they're afraid of losing their meal ticket. The tactics feminists have employed to grease the legal wheels for their sponsored legislation have included deliberate, targeted demonization of men, to the extent of creating a perception of them as subhuman in comparison to women, and portraying women as helpless victims, even of masculinity itself. This portrayal of men as subhuman brutes and women as helpless victims has been instrumental in convincing politicians and their constituents that it's acceptable to pass laws which infringe on people's human rights, as long as it's done in small increments, done only to men, And when it's done, it feels like it's in women's interests. Men's rights activism is in direct confrontation with that, and we can't compromise with feminist activists because that would entail adopting aspects of feminist theory which are in direct contradiction to the best interests of men. Successful advocacy to reduce the discriminatory conditions faced by men partially depends on countering myths and stereotypes about men and women, including those promoted and exploited by feminist advocates. People who are willing to see human rights trampled because men are considered disposable and dangerous, and women valuable and vulnerable, won't be persuaded to want to protect those rights unless their attention is first drawn to male humanity and female agency. It is not possible to fight for reform in any area of law or policy without butting up against feminist interests. Those interests require a guilty demographic, a demographic upon whose human rights it is acceptable to infringe in order to continue the cycle that funds feminism. And they've been very successful at making the male population their boogeyman. It is not that we argue for the same things, but that we often use similar sounding language in direct opposition to each other. And it's not that in having a separate movement, men's rights activists pit men's rights against women's rights either. It's that men's humanity is pitted against feminist power. That conflict leaves the two groups in opposition to each other, whether we want to be at odds or not.